All right, let's get ready to get rocking and rolling in this conversation. We are grateful to have our folks here. Thankful, I hear we have interpreters here in the room for some of our relatives who need that. So thank you so much. That's our interpreters. Thank you, Felicia, April, and Juliana, our deaf interpreters. So grateful for them. We're going to go ahead and lean forward in this conversation as we're moving forward. Hello to everyone. If I haven't had the blessing of meeting you before, Reverend Ben McBride, the founder of Empower Initiative and our Live Free California effort. But I'm just a brother.
Tim, are
like
you able to
all
see anyone's name on the bottom of your screen?
In the struggle. So, Tony, I think I can hear you. Okay, so we are just a part of this struggle, trying to work around the conversation of ending community violence and police violence. We're grateful as a part of the Othering and Belonging Conference today to be having a conversation around bridging across Black Lives Matter. It is no secret to any of us that over the last particularly 7 to 8 years, or actually 10 years since the murder of Oscar Grant in the city of Oakland, that there has been a continual phenomena and an awareness and an awakening for many outside of the Black community of state violence on Black bodies. And a part of this conversation today is to think about how we, as folks who are engaged in both undoing police violence as well as seeking to undo community violence, how we have a conversation together about, at times, what can be a challenging dynamic around how we ensure that we protect lives, considering the different kinds of impact that are happening. I want to also just opportunity for Brother Tim, who's going to be helping to co-facilitate this conversation with me, to just give a quick greeting and welcome to the people.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Cornegay, and I am the director of Live Free California. Live Free California is a statewide coalition of Black-led organizations, a diverse group of Black-led organizations from across the state of California, brought together to deal with the issues exactly of what we're talking about today. Community-based gun violence, police-sponsored gun violence, and like having a safe space to have that conversation where we really can bridge and develop a shared analysis to move forward and design a Black agenda so that we can address the conditions that are giving fuel to this thing that is really being destructive in the communities that we come from and those communities that we represent. And at that, I'll hand it back to Ben.
So let's dig into the conversation. We're going to start off this first conversation. We're still waiting for a few of our relatives who may have gotten stuck in the journey coming onto this platform. Uncle Bobby, who is the uncle of Oscar Grant, and Aunt B, who have worked with families that have been impacted by police violence. So maybe we'll start the first conversation with myself, the soul sister Kat Brooks and sister Tony McNeil. And so I'm going to create some space for them to both introduce themselves, really about how maybe you might enter this conversation with why does the conversation around police violence matter, and why is it critical within this moment that we're in. But I want to say, a quick moment for myself around how I stepped into this work as somebody who engaged as a community violence interventionist, somebody who relocated into a part of Oakland with some purpose, because I wanted to think about what it meant for me to close my proximity to the loved ones who were being impacted by community violence, only for me to end up in Ferguson in 2014 and be challenged to say, you're here to show up for Mike Brown in our city, but our question is, how are you showing up for the loved ones that are being impacted by police violence in the city of Oakland? So they sent me back home, telling me that I didn't need to be flying across the country to show up in somebody else's story if I wasn't figuring out how to show up in the story that was around the corner for me. And I found over the course of time the difficulty at times to hold both the community violence challenge that we were seeking to solve, while also thinking about how we needed to hold the police violence pandemic that we were seeking to solve. And it was during that tenure that I got blessed to really come into some deeper relationship with Sister Kat Brooks and the leadership that she was already engaging in the city of Oakland, and the work that she begun to do across the state with Justice Teams Network. And so I wonder, Kat, if you might just be able to set the stage for us. You've been engaged in this conversation for a long time, with your roots being in the Black Panther movement and the historical movement that is, and certainly with the work that you've done with the Anti-Police Terror Project and being a part of those on the front line in the turn up for Oscar Grant. Can you just kind of set the conversation around why is the conversation about really doing something about the police violence pandemic critical for all of us to care about?
Okay, off mute now. Good afternoon, everybody. Pastor Ben, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. So honored to be on this panel with these folks. When you asked that question, I jotted down, just 4 points that came to me off top. One is we need to understand that Black folks have been resisting since the first African was kidnapped and brought to these shores. Right, like this is nothing new. We also need to understand that policing in America was birthed literally to corral, contain, and cage us. That is why it was born to exist. So it's part of why APTP does not exist in traditional reform efforts, right? We only exist in radical reform efforts because reform means to fix something. Policing in America is not broken, therefore cannot be fixed. The next thing to understand is that police officers, local law enforcement agencies are the frontline soldiers for a much bigger beast of white supremacy. And what they do is offer us a glimpse, like as we're talking about long-term plans for Black liberation, as we're talking about long-term plans for self-determination, they are the frontline soldiers whose job it is to prevent us from getting from here, right, to that place that many of us have dedicated our lives to struggling for. And then this piece, this last piece has become more and more clear to me and more important. I've been more and more focused on the role that trauma plays, not just in violence enacted against by law enforcement, but of course also the violence that is occurring from brother to brother, sister to sister, person to person inside of our communities. And that if we do not address that trauma, if we do not interrupt that trauma, not ask the state to do it, not rely on the state to do it, you're never gonna eradicate violence from our communities. And police are consistent creators of trauma, right, on a daily basis, from profiling our community members, targeting our community members, beating our community members, raping our community members, incarcerating our community members, and the most egregious form of state violence when they murder our community members. And that trauma that they inflict on just from being an occupying army on our streets every day, walking outside of your door, right, and seeing the army of police that are inside of our communities rolling down our blocks. That is trauma, right? And when we have unprocessed trauma, it comes out in all sorts of ways. So those would be a couple of reasons, Pastor Ben, why we all need to be focused on this issue. That and then I'm sorry, finally, and then I'll end. I see Uncle Bobby didn't shut up. What's up, Uncle Bobby? We all want safety. We all want safe communities. We all want our children to make it and thrive, right? And what we have been told police do and what they actually do are worlds apart. Law enforcement in this country as it exists does not create safety. It actually escalates and increases the danger for us in our communities.
Kat, again, for all of those that have continued to join, we are having across Black Lives Matter a conversation between interventionists, organizers, and activists who have been working, family members also, who have been working to think about how do we save Black lives, not just in the conversation around police violence, but also in the conversation around communal violence. And I wonder, Uncle Bobby, if we could get you here into the conversation. Your nephew and his life being taken away from you all and subsequently from our community lit a fire across the country over the last 10 years to really declare Black Lives Matter. And I've been in the space where you've actually helped us remember that it wasn't only the blood of Brother Michael Brown and Brother Trayvon in 2013 that somehow started the Black Lives Matter movement, but it was Oscar and that first vision that we all had on that cell phone that ran around the world. I wonder if you could speak to us as we just set the conditions for this conversation around why is it important give us 3 to 4 minutes around why is it important for us to really hold central this conversation around the police violence pandemic.
I got it. Sorry for the struggle and the lateness first. I'm at work and I couldn't get on for nothing. So I had to walk across the street to a Starbucks to make a connection. So anyhow,
happy to be here.
Thank you, Karanga. Good seeing you. Good seeing everybody. You do Kat, of course. You, Pastor Ben McBride. But yeah, for those who may not know, Oscar was murdered in Oakland on January 1st, 2009 at the Fruitvale Park Station. And as a result, of course, of his murder, technology in the sense of cell phones was the reason why we were able, along with the community, to be able to get, for the first time in state history, an officer arrested, charged, convicted, and sent to jail. Now, we don't count it as a victory, but we do highlight it as a historical mark in the struggle to get justice when it comes to our loved ones being killed by the police. But during that movement, what's really important for us to understand, and for the listeners to know, is during that movement, one of the founders, actually two of the founders, Elisa Garza, as well as Patrice Cullors, were a part of the Oscar Grant movement for justice. And it was not just them two, but the community of Oakland, of course, many that really believed what happened to Oscar was an atrocious act by police, but supported the movement. We're talking about the ILWU, Longshoremen Union, Alameda County Labor Council, as well as the San Francisco Labor Council, many unions, and of course, definitely the community that embraced us, stood with us, cried with us, went back and forth to court with us, but most importantly, utilized their First Amendment right to speak to the essence of the murder of Oscar Grant. And it was from that movement where Elisa has shared with us, and as with the world, that the idea of Black Lives Matter mattered then. Of course, we know approximately 3 years later, I believe, when Trayvon was murdered, they elevated the idea because a love letter was written to Black folks concerning the murder of Black people by the police. But the whole idea was conceived, just listening to Elisa and Patrice during the Oscar Grant movement. And many of us that was in Oakland know the idea about Black Lives Matter then, because of the murder. Because of the murder that was occurring with Black folks in Oakland.
Push the little three dots.
I'm kind of thrown off. Somebody's on. Somebody need to mute.
No, go ahead and finish up, Uncle Bobby.
Oh, okay. How much time do I have? You said a couple of minutes, right?
Yeah, just give us another minute around why this conversation is important, and then we're gonna circle back around.
Right. And so, in essence, this conversation is extremely important because, sadly, just in the state of California alone,
when I push the screen, do I push share screen?
And how many has been murdered per year? Since Oscar's murdered, over 2,000 Californians has been murdered by the police. And if we see the New York Times on September 30th, we saw that many here in the United States, I believe it was 31,000 have been killed by the police. That's being underreported. So this conversation is critical to us understanding just how devastating police murder is in this country, and more specifically for us in Oakland.
It should be a what? Oh, yes.
Thanks, Uncle Bob, lifting that up. So who's going to finish off just our first round of conversation as we're asking ourselves, why is the conversation about police violence important? I want to toss it over to Dope Sister McNeil, has been organizing in the Central Valley. I know you were just coming off the heels of doing some organizing work around a young brother who was nearly killed by the police in Stockton, California, and doing organizing work. Can you say a little bit from your perspective around why is this conversation around confronting police violence important for us to have? Why is this conversation necessary?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So my name is Tony McNeil. I'm a community organizer with Faith in the Valley in the Central Valley. I hail and reign from Stockton, California, which at one point we had like 71 homicides within 1 year, which is a very high number for our population size. So the first thing that I did in order to kind of shape and frame the significance of this conversation, I wanted to really make sure I had some clear numbers. And so why is this conversation important? It's important because you have $223.5 million in the Stockton General Fund for the year 2021. 143.5 million of that budget went to the police budget. That's 95% of the general budget. And 55% of that then makes up the budget, when only $2 million goes to the Office of Violence Prevention's budget annually. And so if you're then, for me, what's happening is your budget then dictates what the values are of the community. It dictates the values that the people are voting into that. And most of the general budget is made up by tax dollars that the people have to vote in order to support for it to be implemented. So there has to be an educating for the community members around why it is that we're putting so much fund. Is we're looking for law enforcement to solve all community problems. We are looking for law enforcement to solve all problems that those that are driving the vote don't even want to see. So then when you have a young man like Devin Carter, who was brutally beaten by law enforcement officers, part of that has to do with not being educated in regard to they're over-policing the Black community. They're over-policing Black youth. They're over-policing Black men within the community. There are no real checks and balances. There's too much funding that is going into the punitive punishment part of it. And there's no resources going into restorative justice, the healing part of the community. As far as training, I don't even want to talk about training. That shouldn't even be on the table right now because that's still more money then that we have to take from budgets that are coming in, not going into our community, into policing. So, I mean, it to me, that pretty much is in a nutshell why this conversation is important to have, Pastor Ben, because we need to educate the people why it is not, why policing, you can't just police Black and brown people in the community. There has to be restorative practices that are in place. And we need to find ways in order to express that, especially when we have a broad voter base that really is dictating where the funding is going.
Appreciate that, Sister Tony, and all the perspectives I think have been offered around this notion around we've got to be very sober and clear about, as Kat was laying out, who police have always been, why the system was created in the first place, and the impact that it's had on us. Uncle Bobby fleshed out even more the reality for us to recognize how much this impacts family. And I think Tony was building a strong case around us also realizing the way that our public resources are being used in ways that actually aren't bringing about the kind of relief that we really need in our communities. I want to toss it over to Tim to maybe invite the next group of our relatives in, because the way we want to have this conversation is also recognize there's one conversation around the impact of police violence on the Black community. And then at the same time, there's another conversation that we're holding around the reality that because of the criminal conditions, I would argue, of the state that have subsequently created economic inequality and subsequently an underground economy that has, as a part of it, community violence at its core, it's created a dynamic where our loved ones have been lost at the hands of one another. And so I want to toss it over to Tim as we want to bring in families who've been impacted by community violence to help us flesh out the conversation more around why the conversation of community violence is as important as the police violence conversation that we need to have. Let me toss it over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Reverend Ben. As he said, there's another portion of this conversation where individuals are suffering from the impact and effects of community violence. So we have a few folks that we've invited to share how they feel, how they're impacted. And the first person that I would like to go to share a bit of, to tell us who she is and share a bit of her story is Pastor Najuma Smith.
Everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you, Tim and Pastor McBride, for allowing me to be on this wonderful panel, and greetings to all of my co-panelists. I'm Reverend Najuma Smith Pollard. I'm the pastor of Word of Encouragement Church here in Los Angeles, but I'm also the assistant director for community and public engagement for the Center for Religion and Civic Culture, and handle all the programming at the Cecil Murray Center for Community Engagement at all of which happens at USC. And so I want to first say that this is not an either or conversation. Both conversations are equally important and must happen all the time until we bring about healing and change to our communities on both fronts. I had an experience. My oldest son, Daniel, was murdered in 2018. And so I bring to this conversation, while I work closely with a lot of organizations here in LA around police violence, I also work closely with, for the last several years, before my son was murdered, around community violence. And so I've said before in past conversations that, our communities have to deal with two kinds of worries. You have to worry about the cop or have to worry about the criminal. And so that's the place that I speak from today. And this conversation around community violence, I think, cannot happen in a vacuum. And I would argue that a lot of the community violence that we see and experience have deep systemic roots. I do not buy into nor prescribe to the narrative that Black and Brown people are more violent or they have more issues than any other community. There are deep systemic ties to the violence that we see within our communities, but it's not because we are a more violent people or a more aggressive people, or all the false narratives that have been written and put out there about Black and Brown communities, which then argues for more policing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but what has to happen is we do have to find answers and some resolution to deal with the root issues, so we can, minimize, lessen the violence within our own communities, much of which is connected to economics, education, health, mental health, and all the other list of social justice issues that many of us work towards today. So I think it's an important conversation, but to not have that conversation, to not include the systemic roots as part of that conversation would be an injustice to our community, because all of it is tied to some systemic issues.
Thank you, Reverend Najuma, for that. Now, what I clearly heard and what resonates with me is there is no either or.
Absolutely.
That there shouldn't be a choice between the fight for those needs being addressed from the folks who've been impacted by police violence and those who've been impacted by community violence. And at that point, I'd like to
and let me just say this, Tim, and that's where activists, but also people who are, engaged in these conversations need to pay attention to, because oftentimes to derail the conversation around police violence, the response is, what about the community violence? Yeah. Well, trust me, nobody in my community wants the violence. So yes, we are here to battle and confront both fronts. But what we have to be very aware of and discern is when people attempt to use community violence to derail from the conversation around police violence. They're both equally important. They both equally have to be dealt with. And I don't have to choose which one I want to fight and stand up against in battle. I'm doing both.
And that's why this conversation we're having is so critically important, because that's a challenge that we're facing. How do we bridge those two spaces where they're in communication with each other and realize that there's so much commonality, and there shouldn't be an opportunity for any system or institution to jump in between the two and leverage it for the sake of the things that they want to become important. And I think there, I would like to go to Kariga, and Kariga, let us hear how you feel about this issue.
All right, this is clear audio. Folks are here.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. I guess before the topic at hand is just really holding space for the lives that bring us here. Our lives, our loved ones' lives. They bring us to this conversation, never separate from what we're still working through today. So I just want to acknowledge the love that everybody is standing in legacy and in dedication to their loved ones who we've lost. It doesn't really matter how. It's the fact that we're working through this space. So I really want to acknowledge and lift that. I also want to, I'm hearing this conversation on state-sponsored violence and community violence. And respectfully, they're in many ways all funded by the state in a lot of instances. Poverty is big business. Poverty is funded. As unique as it sounds, it's a design. It's not a scarcity of overall resources. We also have to take into account that we are describing two instances of violence that are impacting the same community. So in this space of healing and growth, I'm very little invested or interested in looking at who and why. The fact that this same community is hurting in multiple iterations. And in many cases, both institutions were supposed to be able to trust. We are supposed to be able to trust one another. We are supposed to be able to trust police. I know that's a very utopian idea, but I love when a good police officer steps in to show how trustworthy police should be. But that's just the presentation of one individual, not the agency. So in my experiences, I'm still deeply investigating how to serve the community that feels under attack from multiple angles, when that harm is repetitious, often without consequence. How then do we serve? How do we enable the voices of other families that I know who can help join spaces like this or co-create spaces like this in their own communities as well? Ultimately, a mind that has been able to investigate its grief, take time with that reality, look at the systemic designs that are impacting what has taken place. Those minds are so durable and so powerful. I'm so interested in hearing what someone has to say who's been able to survive 3, 4, 5, 6 years and still have some mental faculty, still have some sense about them. That grief is very disorienting. So, I just have very little investment about the either or conversation. It's very clearly that our community, my community, our community, your community is under attack from several different presentations of violence, none of which are okay, all of which have economic ties.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you, Kariga, really is like, how do we address the pain? How do we address the trauma that's left in the wake of this violence, no matter which direction it's coming from, whether it's the police-sponsored violence or the community violence? The one thread that's the commonality, that's the pain and the trauma that it leaves in its wake. And that's really why this conversation is important. So we can start focusing on that and get healthy and whole and start fighting these challenges together. And from there, I would like to go to our other panelist, Kevin Orange.
Tim, just so that you know, Auntie B has been on hold. She is waiting to be let in.
Yeah, we're aware of that, Uncle Bobby. We're trying to get her in right now.
I think you have to unmute, Brother Kevin, so we can hear you. Okay, we'll let's give him another minute or so to see if he can get unmuted, and we'll pull him back in as we move a little bit in the discussion. I'm just conscious of the fact that we are limited on time. We've got probably about another 30 minutes. So let me move us a little bit more into this discussion. So we've heard the perspectives of the collective work that we're all seeking to do in and around police violence. And we've also heard the perspectives of families who've been impacted on both sides of the conversation. Certainly Reverend Najuma spoke to the notion of her son being impacted by community violence. Brother Kareem, I know his brother Kareem, who we hold dear in our heart, was lost to community violence as well. And so I wonder, and I know our brother Kevin, we're going to try to get his audio fixed because I know his family has equally been impacted by the same trauma. I guess as we begin to bridge this together, lift up, and I want to invite us to just unmute and tap your hand, or if you put your finger up, that way we can kind of help unmute folks and get people into the conversation. But I might, ask to those of us who've been doing a lot of our work around police violence, what are questions or things that what are things that you're thinking about around how we bridge the police violence organizing and movement conversation with the community violence conversation, or for folks who've been doing a lot of their work around community violence, what might be some of the questions or things that you would want to invite those that have been working around police violence to think about how we work better together? Let me frame this around why it is that I'm asking this question. Earlier this morning, had the privilege of being on Sister Cat Brooks' radio show. And one of the things that we were sharing was this notion, and Reverend Najuma Smith pointed it out, that oftentimes we are being pitted against one another, where the state is saying we represent the mothers and the fathers of murdered children, and we're here to get more policing to be able to save the day. We've got families that are being impacted by community violence that are looking for immediate relief. And then you also have the same people from our community that are saying we need to defund the police, make the police system smaller, reinvest those dollars into community resources to prevent police violence from happening. And we end up not being in the same conversation together, aligning our strategies together so that we can create the kind of safety that's needed in our communities. And so I'm wanting to lift up this conversation because I know we have it all across the country. What are the things that if you're doing more of your work around police violence that you want to figure out, questions or thoughts that you want to think about around how we bridge the conversation with community violence interventionists, or if you're on the side of community violence often doing your work, what are some of the invitations or questions that you would lift up around how we bridge with the families and the activists that are doing work around police violence? Kat, I see you unmuted. Maybe you kick us off and we'll come to Reverend Najuma.
Yeah, I want to take it one step further, Pastor Ben, and state it the way I stated it when we were in conversation this morning, right? I mean, what is happening right now as we are in this progression, right, of our movement for liberation, what is documented as happening right now in urban cities across the country is an intentional and strategic collaboration between law enforcement departments, police associations, and primarily mayoral administrations to spread misinformation amongst our communities, to capitalize off of the real pain, fear, and trauma that we are living in, with the COVID-19 epidemic, the economic epidemic that came on its heels, and then, of course, which pushed more people into the underground economy, and yes, did result in an uptick of violence. What they were hoping to have happen was because of that uptick of violence and the desperation of people that folks would, right, that the tides would shift back the other way and folks would be running towards the entity that we've been lied to all of this time and told that it creates safety, right? And a lot of us have. Like, talk here in Oakland, our biggest problem, right, forward-facing problem, wasn't white folks, right? It was our folks. But I had to have compassion for that because it's our folks that are living in the mire and muck. So there is this strategy and this tactic that is happening, and it's gross and it's disturbing when we see law enforcement departments acting more like political parties than law enforcement agencies. And I want to remind us that in the 1990s, right, after the governor, 80s and 90s, excuse me, after the government flooded our community with dope, and again, right, substance abuse, upticks in crime, we were begging for the 1994 crime bill. We were begging, right, for the 3 strikes law, only to be drastically disappointed because not only did crime not go down, but our families were ripped away from us. Our loved ones were torn away from us by the thousands, further destroying our community. And the data and the research, right, talks about whole and holistic communities as being one of the primary drivers of community safety. So of course, everything went downhill. And so as part of this conversation, right, because actually I think it's one conversation. All violence is state violence. APTP has always said that, right? The state is the one that facilitates the conditions for our loved ones to be dying in these streets, whether it's at the hands of someone that looks like them or the hands of somebody that's in the blue. It comes from that same place. So it's one conversation. And so the conversations that I want to have are really rooted in political education, the facts and the data, because all of that is the same. And starting from a place of we all want the same thing. We all want safe places. We all want safe communities. I know I said that before. And as a people, all of us need to do interruption of trauma. I want us to have conversations that go, along the lines of what Brother Kariga was talking about who was benefiting. Who was benefiting from this? I've been doing this work a long time. My head exploded when, despite getting a $38 million uptick in the birthplace of the defund movement, this iteration of the defund movement, Oakland, California, when despite getting a $38 million increase, the police lost their minds about an $18 million increase in prevention strategies. So I want to have a conversation with each other about why and who benefits, right? What is organizing? What does trauma-informed organizing look like? And what is our collective strategy to talk to our people who are caught up in the middle of this red tape and political BS that is preventing a lot of us from taking the types of steps forward that we need to be taking in this moment?
I'm appreciating you hear that. And I see Reverend Najuma clapping their hands together. I know you wanted to jump in here as well. Yeah. Let's continue to build out this conversation as we're listening and hearing one another. We're trying to capture some of this in the chat. What do you, as you've stated, who for the last few years has lived at that intersection of community violence and police violence and has been impacted in losing your son, what is it that we need to know? How do we need to nuance this conversation even more to ensure that we're including all of us in the circle of human concern?
Yeah, and I thank you, Pastor McBride, and thank you to Kat, because similarly, along the lines of what Kat was saying, is there isn't what I see at number one is the unpacking of the lie that police create public safety. It's a lie. It's a lie that's been sold to our communities. It's a lie that's been sold to our schools. I had a conversation with a woman who was talking about how her son had some run-ins with some guys at school, and so she felt like school police was the answer. And I said to her, ma'am, do you recognize that if your son is jumped at school or any interaction at school, the police actually not coming until he's actually been jumped or something has happened to him? So the notion of safety doesn't actually exist, because unless we are going to train our police to somehow be precogs from the movie, where they can somehow see crime happen before it happens, police aren't actually even engaged with our situations until something has happened. So the notion of public safety through policing is a lie. It's just a lie. It never existed. It never was. So similar to Kat, I think we have to do a lot of unpacking around the lie that having more police or increased policing in areas where there's an increase in violence, that's a lie. The second thing is, to what Correga was saying, is that there are so many roots to our violence within our communities around economics. And so they did a study here in Los Angeles. I want to say it was a Rand Corporation, but don't quote me on that. And they did like this point graph, and they charted cities in and around Los Angeles, Santa Monica, Palisades, South LA, so on and so forth. And where the red dots were is where they did a study for children who had like off the chart trauma, right? And so when you looked at this chart, concentrated in South LA, it was red dots everywhere. So if we're going to bridge the conversation, we need to divest your funds, Mr. Police Officer, because number one, if this small 10-mile radius is experiencing this much trauma, you're not keeping us safe, number one. So you're failing at your job. But number two, the economics, the funding needs to come here so that these young people can get the trauma needs they have, because we all know that children who experience trauma, how dare you expect me to concentrate in school on a level where there are kids that don't have the same level of trauma exposure? And so, or, behave, or, not act out all the things that all the lies are told about our children. And we're not saying that children are not, they're responding to their trauma. That's really what's happening. It's not because they're bad kids. I hate to hear people call kids bad. They're responding to their trauma, responding to the negative impact of the economics that's around them. And so the way we bridge the conversation is, number one, if in this concentrated area, crime that's creating trauma is at this level, then you being in my community more, you're failing at your job. Clearly you're failing and it doesn't work. Therefore, we need to lower the funding, fire you, whatever, because it's not working. And that's what we're talking about, that breaking down this lie. Because if in fact policing our communities was effective, then there shouldn't be a reason why the red should be so red in communities like South LA. They're not actually creating more safety, more peace, and less trauma. And so those are the things that we have to look at. And to Kat's point, there has to be a lot of education done to bring these things to light and to really offer that police, by and large, do not create safety unless they're precogs, unless they're connecting to precogs. They cannot create public safety because a crime has to happen, or at least start before they're even called to the scene. And then by the time they get there, they're lucky if they actually catch the person that was committing the said crime. And so there's a whole unpacking of the lie. And to Kat's point, there was a time where a lot of folks did want to see the crime bill and, the war on drugs and all that, because again, we were fed this lie that we need to police the problem, police the crack epidemic. No, we just need y'all who have planes and trains and automobiles that get crack in our community. We just need y'all to stop that. If y'all stop that, we won't have crack in our community. So it's all this unpacking of lies and educating and re-educating our community so we can then shift to really solving and healing our community and really shifting the economics on things.
If I can, if I can, I'd like to jump in on that. We as activists, us that is on this panel, and many in the community that's been at this work for years know this lie. But the impacted mother, the impacted family, whether it's police or community, does not know, because they're new to this whole idea of policing in this country and why we're being killed by them. And what we've discovered in our journey, especially dealing with families that's been impacted by police violence, was that there had to begin an educational aspect to how the police got here, why they're here, And sadly, many of the loved ones that has been killed, why it's been justified as a justifiable homicide. But what I'm getting at, the community that needs to know this is not only the impacted families of police violence and the families, especially of community violence, believing that more policing is going to bring about more safety to the community. And because of that, that creates the automatic divide.
Mhm.
So what we have found is that we have to create opportunities to educate, especially our community violence folks and mothers and fathers, that lining up with the police and believing that they're doing the right thing in their investigation, because many times they're not.
Absolutely.
That, that is a problem in itself. And so I wanted us to be clear that we have to begin to educate our communities on this issue that is centered around dividing, because we see it all the time.
Mhm.
I want to stand with Uncle Bobby on this intersection. We know each other well. We know each other well from service. We know each other well from healing spaces. And the timeline of my brother's murder is following that of Oscar Grant. So I come to the space already informed on that all violence is state-sponsored violence. I come to the space informed because of proximity, right? Because of wanting to get in and serve and learn. Before you even say, you can serve. So because of proximity, I'm learning the language, I'm learning the dynamic, I'm learning the institution. So I had the unfortunate privilege of knowing that the police weren't my family's friend concerning my brother's homicide. I remember going to court and learning that it was the state of California versus the shooter, right? And I remember how interesting, complex that language was, that the state was seeking their retribution, they were seeking their consequence, their financial consequence from my brother's murder. And I also remember the same state sending police to my family's house when we were grieving. So in my family, a Jamaican culture, we hold something called Nine Night. This is the night before. We're having a family gathering, no different than anybody from the diaspora, but the police were called to our house as if we were creating a disturbance. There were no sort, right? My immigrant grandmother has been on that block longer than anybody, owned that house longer than anybody. So we knew it wasn't the community members around us calling the police, right? It was the police inability to see us gather and assume that crime wasn't happening or that safety wasn't happening. We were most safe with each other, right? We didn't need their inquiry or intervention. I just want to paint that as a picture, to contextualize how I understand that they didn't serve or any interest. But I want to also go back to what when Kat was talking about the trauma-informed training, the thing I know about this from being in proximity to so much harm is that pain unaddressed, the idea that we aren't safe with each other, it's also very unique where people stand on their position with law enforcement, as also it relates to their positionality or their understanding of empathy. That is, everybody is good until harm comes their way. Then they want to seek the most aggressive prosecution that the state has to offer, that the state's foot soldiers, the police, are carried out to go hunt this person down. And until we have a better understanding of the full scope and sequence of the human psychological development and who we are emotionally and where we are spiritually, we're going to keep running to somebody who we think can solve it for us, right? But there's deeper work that is embedded in each one of us. It comes by spaces of this. It comes by, you imagine the conundrum I have in my head when I learned that the gunman who shot my brother also has a father who's in prison, who's incarcerated for life. And imagine the conundrum it put in my head that in so many instances, as a public school educator in DC, Oakland, Philly, you name it, me having so many young people who I knew were involved in gun violence in their community, how was I able to love them and find value in them?
Absolutely.
Right? In their 13, 14-year-old space. And I have zero ability to understand the man who shot my brother as an evolved young person who never got a chance to sit in my classroom. Right? So it put me in a great state of moral and personal conflict and what my role would be in ending this violence. And I'm still there.
I'm appreciating what you're saying, Karika. So we've got about 10 minutes left. And so I'm going to pivot us to this. I'm going to ask both Kat and Uncle Bobby to think about a final, the next step you would ask folks to do as we think about this notion of there's been a disinformation campaign for hundreds of years to cause our people to somehow feel that the same people who have been causing us harm and creating the solutions for the harm against our people are the people that can solve the solution. What's a next step you would invite those folks to do? But before we come to you all to help us close it out, I want to give this next charge, not charge, but an invitation to share both to Sister B. I know we've got on. Thank you for fighting through those technical difficulties with Sister Tony, and then also Brother Kevin, to just say a couple words. And we'll start with you, Sister B, because I know you all have been doing work to try to bridge this conversation with families that have been impacted by both police violence and community violence, with y'all amazing work with Families United for Justice and the Love Not Blood campaign of the country. What are the ways that you have seen work to begin to bridge that conversation and to expand the conversation and to tackle the disinformation campaign that somehow policing are the answer for our families that are being impacted by community? What solutions have worked for you?
Thank you, Reverend Ben, and thank you all on the panel. I'm honored to be here with you. I just wanted to say one of the things that so God willing, April 2022, we will host the first Community Families United for Justice conference, where we will host families impacted by community. And this has been something that the community have been asking us for years and years, but there's no way we could have done both of them from the times with the police. And, and we have shared with community some of the they could use that they could have been done it before now that we're doing it. But the thing with our community, it is us. And so as we prepare for this conference, we know that the workshops, releases, policy, all that kind of stuff, which is true in the community, but our community, Families United for Justice, will have to start with the internal with us. These workshops are going to have to be so deep because we are the community. We are the police in our community. The police departments are not going to solve our issues. It comes from us loving each other and wanting for our brothers and sisters what we want for ourselves. You're not going to want death for your brothers and sisters if you love them. And so the work that has to be done in our community, it's like everyone said, it comes from us and it's with us. And if we could get, like I talk to the community families all the time, I share with them, if you're going to go for the police, go after them. They're not solving your cases. They're not even trying to address who killed your child for real. You can't even go to them and tell them information without your life being in danger. That's just atrocious for us to live in that kind of environment. And it comes from us not holding the police accountable. They should be held accountable in our community for community violence just as well as they should be held accountable when they murder us in the and
yes.
as a beautiful community, we must get back to the essence of love of one another. And those are some of the deep workshops that we will, God willing, and I hope that everyone on here can join us and contribute to these workshops that we need to internally fix our community. Because once that love, we give that love back to each other, we start loving each other and wanting for our brothers and sisters what we want for ourselves, then we can start making waves to make the outsiders that come in our community, we can hold them accountable. Once we start loving each other and holding each other accountable. So I just wanted to share that. The information on here was great. We all have much work to do. There's enough work for everybody. And collectively, we have to do this. And I'm going to say this one thing. I know that police and community families, one day, this is just my opinion, one day going to come together. But because of the things that people have mentioned on here, it just don't gel like people think it should, because everybody got the same. Well, okay, your loved one is dead. That pain is there. Yeah, so now we're going to all just come in here, get together. Because the systematic BS that our families are fed, like everybody have said, they don't know the things that we know on here. It's our duty to tell them the truth about policing. And the policing, even with community violence, is not just because the police is killing. They are contributing to everything rotten in our community. And you want some more of them. And you look to them.
Let me go ahead and jump in here.
So I'm going to
just
just
real
say
quick,
that,
just as
and
we're
hopefully
coming down the line. I want to get a few
do
more
this and
voices
come together
in here.
and really give
Sister
these
Tony, if you'll
families
just allow
impacted
me
by
to get Brother
community
Kevin in here. I know he
just
has
what they
been
need
fighting with some
to go
technical
back and
difficulties,
fix
and
their
then we're going to
community.
go
And
to
it's in the
you and
same
then Sister
line
Kat
when
and
we
Uncle
do
Bobby to close us
our
out.
Families
But
United
Brother
for Justice.
Kevin, we
These
know you've
families
been
go
doing
back
great
with
community
tools
gun
to go
violence
back and
intervention
fight
work
for
in LA.
justice for their
Can you just
loved
say a
ones.
few words and
We
thank the
want to
good
do
brother
the
for
same
continuing to
thing with
fight the
our
fight on this
community
platform
families, to
to
go
get
back with
into this
tools,
space?
to
What would
love
you
your
want to just
community, and
invite us to think about as we think
and
about the
then we
impact of
can begin to
community
start talking about
violence
policy.
and
We
the
can
work that
start
we need to
holding
do
police
around it as we're
accountable,
doing the work
but
around
there's
police
just something we
violence?
got to straighten out about
Well,
ourselves.
first of
Thank you,
all, excuse me
Reverend.
for having any difficulty. I really want to be a part of this process. But for me, quickly, is accountability for us as Black men, holding each other accountable for the things that we did
Am I
in our
done?
community.
Hello?
We done went so far if blame
Hello?
others are to blame for the things that didn't happen in our community, but we as Black men, we got to step up and take on responsibility for the things that we caused, the pain that we did to our families, to our Black urban communities, to our mothers, grandmothers. We destroyed communities. We got to take ownership of that, and for us to start stepping into these spaces to where we want to start restoring and rebuilding our community to some stability, some safe stability, mentally and physically. We here now. And I'm glad we're in these spaces now where we having these conversations to where we can talk to one another opposed to shooting and want to fight one another. The more we keep talking about foolishness and the hate against each other, there's no way we can build with each other. We need men and women rebuilding, restoring our communities, and then redefining what a Black man is. We got so many people out there telling us what we are and what we should be. There is not one model that defines us as a Black man. We got to fill in all the spaces in order for us to restore ourselves to some right stability, because we know we done disobeyed our master who created us. We fell out of his grace, whatever you might call him, but we know we answer to one person, one God. And until we get our things together and start loving each other the way we was meant to be, I think we're going to keep running into each other and these problems. But I think there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is hope at the end of the tunnel, because a lot of us that I work with really don't realize we're not supposed to be here, but we're here for a reason. And that's why our fight is critical for us. And when we got into this fight, we went 1,000% in making sure that we get the resources that we need to fight this war that we've been fighting, because like we know what law enforcement have been doing to us for forever, but I want to focus on us, what the Black man done, what we done to each other. I don't want to walk down the street and have to be looking at somebody pulling up in a car that look like me, that want to assistance. And when we take that fear away from seeing one another, I think we're along much better. But as far as the funding, I think
Appreciate that, Brother Kevin. So let's go. We are about time, and so we need to give a last invitation. So why don't we go in this order? Because why don't we have Sister Tony give one step that you would invite people around how they can think about bridging this conversation together. Give us one step, Sister Tony. Uncle Bobby, give us a step folks can take, and Kat, close step that we can take to really undo the disinformation that is causing our community to be fractured. Let's start with Sister.
Ben, I can defer. I put my steps in the actual chat. So if that will help.
Tony, pay attention to her steps. Uncle Bobby, one step we would challenge our listeners to move forward in.
We have to expose the statistics of policing in our community. I mean, how many crimes are actually being solved? How many shootings in our community that actually is not really resonating with the community itself? So, and I'll just use this for a quick example. Policing been elevated to a point to where everybody knows that policing is so egregious that something has to be done. We have to raise the level of community violence to a point to where everybody realizes that it's so egregious that we as a people, especially Black people, have to begin to do something on our own to resolve that issue.
Bobby, Kat, take us home. We bridge across Black Lives Matter movement. What's a step that you want to invite folks to take wherever they are around the country to hold both of these conversations as you have for years together?
Don't get frustrated with me, Pastor Ben. I'm gonna say like 3 things, but I'm gonna say them real fast. The first thing is I want you to ask yourself the question, right? And ask each other the question that if the most heavily policed communities are the safest communities, then why is it in our communities where you can't spit, in any direction without hitting a cop car? That's where the so-called crime lives. But in the wealthier neighborhood, police officer in broad daylight with a flashlight, but resources rain down from the heavens, right? There is little to no so-called crime. Just sit in that for a minute, right? I'm an organizer. So I'm talking about what we are doing, and that we've always engaged in communications, and as a strategy, not a tactic, right? And so from the birth of APTP, it was important for us to debate, and we see the fruits of that labor in this conversation: reimagining public safety, right? Redefining public safety, impact the narrative, right? Have the conversation, invest in communications. If you're an organization, you've got to invest in a ground game. We've got to be knocking on our people's doors and having the conversations with them, right? We can't be sitting on Facebook and posting your opinion is not organizing. Period. We need to push back on our electeds, on our law enforcement agencies at the grassroots level. Man, talk to your neighbors, have conversation with your people, and demand divestment. Not because we're saying get rid of police, but because we're trying to get to the issue before it happens, right? Not the reactionary, violent response that this country's been engaged in all this time.
Kat, I'm just thank all of our panelists and everyone who has participated in this conversation. We know that in our communities, we have conversation in this table. We're constantly bridging, even though some of us don't call it bridging. And I think because Black people are going to get freed, we're going to have to continue to bridge. How do we hold space? How do we make sure that we're holding all of our conversations? I really appreciate that challenge. Kat lifting up, how do we use communication and education as a strategy and not a tactic? How do we find ways to elevate more voices so that we're able to widen that circle of human concern, keeping in mind, as we've hoped to demonstrate on this panel, by bringing impact families into this conversation, as Brother Glenn Martin from New York says, that the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So let's continue to figure out how to expand the table, get more people there, not less, so that we can continue to bridge across our movement until all Black lives are mattering in the way that we know they actually do. Deep appreciation to all our panelists: Kat Brooks, Kariga Bailey, Tony McNeil, Uncle Bobby, Aunt B, Brother Kevin Orange, Reverend Najuma Smith. Thank you to our interpreters. And just give us a final word, Brother Tim, on our way out the door.
Thank you guys for this depth of information that you shared. Look forward to working with you all and getting this information to the folks who are in the streets and who are victims of this violence and maybe perpetrators of this violence, and educating them to the level that they understand how important it is to make our community safe so that safety is not a luxury for Black and brown people. I know we could do it. We just have to work together to get it done. So once again, thank you and see you on the battlefield.
Peace, y'all. Let's go to work.